A torn photograph hides more than memory. It hides a crime. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where are you joining from tonight? Your voices bring life to these mysteries. Let's begin. It was one of those mornings when the rain refused to fall, but the sky hung heavy, as though it might at any moment. Maigret sat at his usual corner of the small café, opposite the Quai des Orfèvres. His pipe rested between two fingers, though he had not lit it yet. A glass of beer stood before him, its froth already fading, leaving the rim wet with the trace of his first absent sip. He stared through the window, watching the erratic flow of umbrellas on the pavement, the shopkeepers arranging baskets of fruit with resigned gestures, the office clerks hurrying in the direction of the river. It was not that he was waiting for anything in particular. The morning had begun slowly, and no call had yet disturbed his routine. Madame Maigret had left him with the scent of coffee lingering in his coat, and her voice still soft in his memory, reminding him to buy tobacco before he forgot. It was the sort of day when cases seemed far away, when the world belonged to the ordinary rhythm of people crossing bridges, waiting for trams, buying bread, and yet, beneath that surface, Maigret felt the restlessness he knew too well, a sense that somewhere in the city, a story was already beginning quietly without announcement. He drew on the unlit pipe, more for comfort than habit, his eyes drifting across the rain-dark stones of the street. When the telephone rang inside the café, it startled him more than it should have. The owner, wiping his hands on a cloth, called across in his hoarse voice, "For you, Chief Inspector." It was unusual, almost improper for calls to reach him here. He rose slowly, carrying his glass with him, and took the receiver at the end of the counter. A voice from the other end, hesitant, provincial, introduced itself as coming from a boarding house on the Boulevard Saint-Martin. There had been an incident, the man said, though he struggled to describe it. Not a murder, not exactly. A tenant had been found sitting alone in her room, a torn photograph on the table before her face pale, her lips moving but not speaking. She had refused to answer questions, refused to leave. The concierge did not know what to make of it. Something about her frightened him. Maigret listened without interrupting. His eyes remained on the rain-stained window, where a man was striking a match to his cigarette under the awning. The photograph, torn twice, lingered in his mind more than the silence of the woman. He told the caller to wait, that he would come. Replacing the receiver, he returned to his table only to empty the glass in a single swallow. He lit his pipe at last, filling his mouth with the first familiar draw of smoke. There was no urgency in his step as he left the café, only the steady movement of a man accustomed to such summonses. The air outside was damp and cool. Maigret pulled up the collar of his coat, walked toward the Seine, and thought briefly of Madame Maigret's remark that morning. How people often hide more in photographs than in their own faces. He had smiled at it then, but now it clung to him with a quiet weight. The Boulevard Saint-Martin was not far. He could already picture the house, narrow staircases, peeling wallpaper, the smell of cabbage in the corridor. A woman alone, her life reduced to a scrap of paper torn in anger or despair. And so, without knowing it fully, Maigret had already stepped into the case. Maigret walked slowly along the damp streets, his broad frame moving with the ease of a man who never hurried unless forced, his pipe glowing faintly in the dim light of the morning. The Seine, swollen from days of uncertain weather, lapped lazily against its embankments. He crossed a small bridge, the drizzle brushing against his cheeks, and turned toward the Boulevard Saint-Martin. He had no clear picture yet of what awaited him, only the echo of the concierge's hesitant words and the strange insistence on the torn photograph. It was often like this at the start of an investigation, when nothing had yet taken shape, when the story felt as though it were waiting for him in a silent room, reluctant to reveal itself until he was there to listen. The boulevard was alive with a mixture of early traffic and pedestrians who seemed perpetually in a hurry. Umbrellas clashing in the narrow space of the pavement. Shops were opening, shutters rattling upward, and the smell of fresh bread drifted faintly from a bakery at the corner. Maigret paused for a moment outside the building he sought. It was just as he had pictured it, narrow, soot-stained, with a flaking green door, and a brass plate so dull it barely reflected the light. A dim corridor stretched beyond, heavy with the odor of cooked vegetables, soap and damp wool. Inside, the concierge waited, a thin man with a stoop in his shoulders, his hands clasped tightly as though he feared they might tremble. He wore a grey cardigan buttoned unevenly, and his eyes darted toward the staircase, as if reluctant to remain too long in one place. Maigret greeted him quietly, without ceremony, and asked him to lead the way. They climbed the stairs together, each step creaking under Maigret's weight. "She is on the second floor," the man whispered, as if the woman could overhear him through the walls. "She hasn't moved since we found her. She doesn't speak. There was that photograph on the table. You'll see it yourself." I didn't know what else to do but call. It didn't feel right to call the doctor, not yet. The landing was dim, lit by a single bulb that flickered faintly. Maigret pushed open the door the concierge indicated. The room beyond was small, with faded wallpaper patterned in roses that had long since lost their color. A narrow bed was pushed against the wall, its blanket neatly spread, though one corner hung askew as though disturbed by restless hands. On the table near the window sat a woman. She was not young but not yet old, perhaps in her late 30s. Her dark hair was pulled back carelessly, strands falling across her pale cheeks. She wore a plain dress, the fabric cheap and slightly worn at the elbows. Her eyes were fixed on the torn photograph before her, though she did not appear to be seeing it. Her lips moved faintly, soundlessly, as if forming words too fragile to emerge. The photograph itself was curious. Torn not once but twice, the edges jagged, the image incomplete. Maigret stepped closer, careful not to startle her, and studied the pieces. They had been arranged together again, almost obsessively, though the gaps left by the missing scraps gave the faces within a fractured, unsettling appearance. He did not speak at once. He simply stood, pipe in hand, observing the woman's stillness, the way her hands rested limply in her lap, the way her shoulders seemed to sag under a weight invisible to others. His silence filled the room, and in time she stirred slightly, as though aware of him. Her eyes flicked toward him, then away again, returning stubbornly to the fragments of the photograph. "Madame," Maigret said softly, his voice calm, almost paternal. "You are not in trouble." "I only wish to understand," she did not answer. But her fingers, long and thin, began to trace the torn edges of the paper over and over, as though smoothing wounds that could never be mended. The silence stretched. Maigret sat down slowly in the chair opposite her, his heavy coat brushing against the table leg, his presence filling the small room. He leaned back, pipe resting against his chin, and let the air settle. He knew better than to demand answers. People spoke eventually, if one gave them enough silence in which to hear themselves. After a long moment, the concierge cleared his throat nervously in the doorway, as though unable to endure the atmosphere. Maigret glanced at him once, a glance that sent him retreating back into the corridor without protest. The door closed softly, leaving Maigret and the woman alone. He studied her again. She had the drawn features of someone who had not slept, eyes shadowed, skin sallow. There was a certain dignity in her posture despite the frailty. She might once have been striking, though life had rubbed away the brightness. The room told its own story in hushed tones. A wardrobe with a broken handle, a cracked mirror propped against the wall, a pair of shoes carefully aligned under the bed. Nothing of extravagance, but an orderliness that suggested pride, even in reduced circumstances. The torn photograph seemed to resist interpretation. The portion still visible revealed part of a man's face, the line of a jaw, a mustache blurred by the rip. Another figure beside him had been almost obliterated, only a fragment of hair and shoulder remaining. The woman he thought might once have been there, smiling whole. Now she sat before its ruin, as though it contained all that was left of her life. Maigret did not ask the obvious questions. Instead, he rose quietly and moved toward the window. The street below stretched in both directions, carriages rattling, trams groaning as they passed. He let his eyes rest on the flow of the world outside, allowing her the comfort of his back. After a time her voice came faint but steady, as though speaking not to him but to the room itself. To the room itself. It was mine. He turned slowly, meeting her eyes, though she looked at the photograph rather than at him. "You kept it all these years?" he asked, gently. She nodded, her chin dipping once, her hands tightening on her lap. "And then you tore it." "Twice." At this her shoulders trembled slightly, though she gave no answer. He did not press her. He sat again, folding his large hands over his knees, waiting. Outside the rain began at last, soft against the window glass, a sound that filled the silence like an accomplice. The woman's breathing grew unsteady, but she did not cry. She seemed locked in a struggle within herself, words rising and falling before they reached her lips. Maigret let the silence stretch, then finally asked, "Were you alone when you tore it?" A pause, then a whisper so low he almost doubted it. "No." Her fingers, restless now, began to move against the table, tracing invisible lines. She would say no more, he sensed. Not yet. He rose again, this time to inspect the room more closely. On the dresser, a small bottle of cheap perfume, half empty. In the corner, a handbag, the clasp broken but carefully closed. A chair with one leg uneven, propped with folded paper beneath it. These details told him more than her words. He thought of Madame Maigret's remark that morning, about photographs holding secrets. Here it seemed truer than ever. The photograph had not only been torn but displayed, as if meant to be discovered. A message perhaps to herself or to someone else. The second tier troubled him most. Once might be anger, despair, twice suggested something more deliberate. He turned back to the woman who now sat with eyes closed, her lips still moving faintly as though repeating a phrase to herself. He did not disturb her. He placed his hat carefully on the table beside the photograph and remained standing, pipe in hand, letting the smoke drift between them. When at last he spoke again, it was not a question. Only a quiet observation. "You're waiting for someone." Her eyelids fluttered, but she gave no answer. The silence confirmed it more than words could. Maigret stayed until the light began to fade from the small window, the rain settling into a steady rhythm outside. He did not press her further. Some truths required patience. He knew he would return tomorrow or the day after, and the story would come. It always did. For now he left her there, the torn photograph between them, as though it were the true occupant of the room. He descended the narrow stairs, the smell of cabbage stronger now as someone prepared supper below. The concierge emerged again, anxious for an explanation, but Maigret only shook his head. He stepped into the rain, collar upturned, pipe warm against his lips, and walked slowly toward the quay. The city carried on around him, but in his mind, the silence of that room lingered, the torn edges of a photograph whispering of secrets not yet spoken. He did not know yet what crime lay hidden there, but he knew with certainty that something was wrong. And that was enough. The rain followed Maigret down the boulevard like a companion that refused to be shaken, its rhythm steady on his shoulders as he walked without haste. He had left the boarding house deliberately, knowing there was little more to be gained that day from the silent woman and her fractured photograph. Yet the case, though shapeless, clung to him. He could still see her pale fingers tracing the torn edges, her lips murmuring words she would not share. It was as though she had planted something in him, a question that refused to be formed. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, not out of necessity but habit, where the familiar stone walls and smell of ink on paper seemed to absorb the rain off his coat. Inside, the routine of the police headquarters hummed along in subdued tones. The scratching of pens, the shuffle of reports, the occasional ring of a telephone that seemed more irritating than urgent. Young inspectors passed him in the corridor with quick nods, their eyes darting away from his heavy, impassive face. He acknowledged them with a slow tilt of his head, then made his way to his office. The stove burned low in the corner, its heat barely touching the chill air. He hung his coat, filled his pipe, and sat heavily at his desk. For a time he let himself drift, staring at the smoke as it curled toward the ceiling. He thought of the woman's silence, of the photograph torn not once but twice. He thought of the concierge's nervousness, the kind of fear that came not from violence witnessed, but from something sensed, something unsaid. Boarding houses were like that, full of secrets that pressed against thin walls, where everyone knew too much and yet pretended to know nothing at all. The telephone on his desk rang, sharp against the quiet. He lifted the receiver with the heaviness of one who already knew it would not bring clarity. It was Inspector Lognon, his voice thick with its usual blend of gloom and irritation. He had heard somehow of Maigret's visit to the boarding house. Perhaps the concierge had spoken to someone, or perhaps Lognon had his own ways of knowing. "You spend your time on strange things, Maigret," Lognon muttered. "A woman with a torn photograph? We have real work." Maigret let him speak, his pipe glowing faintly as he listened without interruption. Lognon's voice carried its usual undertone of resentment, the sense of a man forever on the edge of recognition, but never arriving. When the tirade subsided, Maigret answered simply, "There's something there." Lognon gave a derisive snort, but Maigret had already placed the receiver back in its cradle. He had no intention of explaining himself. Not yet. That evening, after supper with Madame Maigret, a quiet meal of stew and bread, her gentle chatter about a neighbor's new curtains filling the silence he did not break, he returned once more to the Boulevard Saint-Martin. He did not tell her where he was going. She did not ask. Between them, there was an understanding that his work often followed him into the night, carried on his shoulders like the dampness of his coat. The concierge looked surprised when Maigret appeared again, his large frame filling the entrance. "She hasn't moved," he whispered nervously, as though this persistence of stillness were itself unnatural. "The photograph is still there. She eats nothing." Maigret nodded, but instead of climbing the stairs at once, he asked the concierge about the other tenants. "Who else lives here?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward the shadowed staircase. "A few clerks," he said. "A seamstress, an old couple on the top floor. Nothing unusual." "And yet," Maigret pressed, "you felt uneasy enough to call me." The concierge hesitated, rubbing his thin hands together. "She's not like the others, keeps to herself. Pays rent on time, yes, but people notice things. She receives letters, sometimes late at night. A man comes rarely, but when he does, she is different afterward. And that photograph, I don't like the way she stares at it." Maigret absorbed this without comment. He asked for the tenants' names, the rooms they occupied. The concierge provided them reluctantly, as though speaking too much might invite trouble. Maigret wrote nothing down. He carried names in his memory, letting them settle like stones at the bottom of a pond until the water cleared and their shapes revealed themselves. He climbed the stairs again, his steps heavy on the worn boards. The woman's door was closed this time. He knocked lightly, then pushed it open without waiting. She was where he had left her, her body unmoved except for the faint trembling of her hands. The photograph remained on the table, as though time itself had halted in that small room. He did not stay long. A few words, no answers. He left again, but this time he did not descend immediately. Instead, he lingered on the second-floor landing, listening to the murmur of voices behind other doors, the sound of a cough, the creak of bed springs. Life went on in the house, indifferent to the silent tragedy unfolding within its walls. He returned the next day and the day after. Slowly, deliberately, he began to speak with the tenants one by one. He never announced it as questioning. He knocked politely, asked for a moment, and stood in their rooms with his hat in hand, his presence filling the space until they felt compelled to talk. He asked about the weather, about their work, about nothing at all. And in their answers, in the way they avoided certain details or spoke too quickly about others, he found the beginnings of a pattern. The seamstress on the third floor, her hands raw from hours of work, spoke of hearing footsteps late at night, heavier than the woman's own. A clerk, pale and nervous, mentioned once seeing her at the post office with a letter she did not post, her eyes scanning the street instead. The old couple on the top floor had little to say, but their silence was weighted, as though they knew more than they dared to tell. Each fragment was small, almost trivial. But to Maigret they carried weight. He began to sense the outlines of something larger, though it remained indistinct like a figure seen through fog. On the fourth evening he returned again. The concierge stopped him at the door, his face pale. "She spoke," he whispered, as though the words were dangerous to repeat. Maigret climbed the stairs more quickly than usual. In her room, the woman was no longer at the table but on the bed. Her body curled inward, the photograph clutched tightly in her hands. Her lips moved, and this time words emerged, faint but clear enough for him to catch. "He left me. He left me twice." Maigret stood over her, his shadow falling across the bed. He did not answer. He only watched as her eyes closed and her fingers tightened on the torn paper. Twice. The word lingered in his mind as he left the room, more troubling than any denial or silence. Once might be betrayal, but twice, what could that mean? Back on the street, the rain had ceased, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the dim lamps. Maigret paused under one, his hat pulled low, his pipe extinguished. He thought of the photograph torn twice, of the woman who waited still, of the tenants who spoke in fragments. It was not yet a crime, not in any official sense. but it carried the scent of one faint and unmistakable, like smoke that lingered long after the fire had gone out, and Maigret knew he would not let it go. The next morning Paris awoke under a low ceiling of clouds, the air heavy with dampness that clung to the skin and slowed the movement of the city. Maigret rose later than usual, having spent much of the night turning in his bed, his mind refusing the comfort of sleep. Madame Maigret had noticed, of course. She always did, though she made no comment beyond placing a second cup of coffee before him, with a glance that carried both concern and acceptance. He drank it slowly, grateful for her silence. It allowed him to remain with his thoughts, which circled endlessly around a photograph torn twice, and the strange words of a woman who whispered of being left not once but twice. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the drizzle had begun again, a fine mist that blurred the outlines of the buildings and made the pavements shine like glass. His colleagues were already immersed in their work, bent over files and reports, the usual air of bureaucracy filling the corridors. To them, crime was measured in paperwork and timetables. For Maigret, it was measured in silence, in the weight of gestures and the absence of explanations. He did not sit at his desk. Instead, he walked straight through, nodding briefly to an officer who attempted to hand him a report. He left it unread. There were other matters pressing, matters that could not be captured in ink. He made his way once again toward the Boulevard Saint-Martin, his pipe clenched between his teeth unlit, a comfort more than a habit. The boarding house was unchanged, its facade streaked with soot, the brass plate dull as ever. The concierge greeted him with a wary expression, his eyes shifting nervously. "She has not spoken again," he said, as though apologizing for the woman's continued silence. "She eats little." "Sometimes I think she does not sleep." Maigret nodded but did not respond. He climbed the stairs, his heavy tread familiar now to the tenants. Doors opened slightly as he passed, curious eyes peering out before vanishing again. He did not knock at the woman's door. Instead, he paused on the landing, considering the narrow corridor with its faded carpet, the faint smell of cabbage that clung persistently to the air. Boarding houses were worlds within themselves, each door concealing a separate life, yet all linked by thin walls through which whispers carried. He began with the seamstress on the third floor. She opened the door reluctantly, her needle still in hand, a piece of cloth draped across her lap. Her room was cramped, dominated by a sewing machine that clattered through long hours. She looked at him with wary eyes, accustomed to hardship, suspicious of intrusion. "I only want to ask about the nights," Maigret said gently, his tone almost conversational. "You work late. You must hear more than most." She hesitated, then shrugged as though the effort of denial was not worth it. "I hear footsteps sometimes, heavy, not hers. He comes late, leaves before morning. Not often, but when he does, she is different afterward. She doesn't greet me. Her eyes look elsewhere, like she's waiting for something that won't come, a man then. Not merely a figure of rumor, but someone real enough to alter her expression, her silence." Maigret asked nothing further. He thanked her and left, his presence filling the small room only long enough for her to feel the weight of her own words. On the second floor, he found the nervous clerk, his spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose. The man shifted constantly, adjusting his cuffs, pushing papers into drawers as though afraid of being discovered in some minor dishonesty. Maigret asked about letters, his voice mild. The clerk swallowed hard before replying. "Yes, she receives them. Not often, but when she does, she hides them quickly. I once saw her at the post office holding one. She tore it in half, then quarters, and threw it away without sending it. She looked frightened, I think." Another tear, Maigret thought, his pipe heavy in his hand. Not the photograph, but letters, also torn, also destroyed. A pattern. He left the clerk trembling slightly at the memory of having said too much. On the top floor, the old couple received him with the courtesy of their generation. Their room smelled of mothballs and old wood, their furniture neat but worn. They offered him a chair tea he declined. They spoke hesitantly, as though each word might carry consequences. "We hear arguments sometimes," the old woman said, her voice low. Not shouting, no, but the kind of voices that cut deeper for being quiet. A man's voice, hers too, then silence. Long silences. Her husband nodded, his hands folded over the head of his cane. "He comes less often now. She waits, but he does not come, and each time she waits, something in her seems to break. Maigret listened, his large frame still in the small chair, his pipe unlit, his eyes half closed as if drowsy. But inside, the fragments began to settle into place like pieces of a puzzle not yet complete, but beginning to suggest its image. A man who came rarely, whose presence altered her, whose absence broke her. Letters received and destroyed. A photograph torn twice. He thanked them and descended the stairs, his mind quiet but alert. On the landing, the concierge waited, his hands wringing nervously. "Did you learn something?" he asked, his voice eager but fearful. Perhaps Maigret answered non-committal. He stepped outside into the drizzle once more, pulling his collar up against the damp. He walked without direction, letting the streets of Paris guide him, his thoughts circling slowly. He stopped eventually at a small cafe, ordered a glass of beer and sat near the window where he could watch the passers-by. He thought of the woman's words. He left me. He left me twice. The first abandonment was clear enough. The man who came and went, whose presence was rare, whose absence was heavier. But the second, what kind of leaving was that? Something deliberate, perhaps. A rejection repeated. Or worse, a betrayal layered upon betrayal. He drank slowly, letting the beer warm his chest. Outside, the rain blurred the outlines of faces, umbrellas colliding, coats pulled tightly. The city seemed indifferent to his thoughts, yet he felt its pulse align with his own. Ordinary lives, each carrying secrets, small tragedies, hidden guilt. This was Paris, this was his work. That evening he returned again to the boarding house. The woman remained in her room, the photograph still on the table, though now she clutched only one piece, the fragment showing the man's jaw and moustache. Her lips moved faintly as he entered, but no words came. He stood by the window, pipe in hand, saying nothing. After a time she whispered again, twice. Her voice cracked, raw from silence. Maigret turned then, his eyes resting on her face. "You mean he returned?" Her gaze flickered, but she did not answer. The silence was answer enough. When he left her that night, he knew he was no longer merely observing sorrow. There was guilt in that room, guilt heavy enough to silence, to destroy photographs, to tear letters to shreds. Somewhere in the house or beyond it, someone carried the other half of the story. The rain had stopped. The streets shone darkly under the lamps, reflecting the blurred glow of shop windows and cafe signs. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the smoke curling upward into the night. He did not yet know the man's name, but he could feel his shadow in every corner of that narrow house, and Maigret knew shadows had a way of revealing themselves, if one only waited long enough. Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres the next morning, with the heaviness of the case sitting in his chest like damp wool. The corridors smelled of stale tobacco and ink, the usual rhythm of clerks hurrying with papers, voices raised in disputes over reports, and the hollow echo of footsteps on stone floors. Yet he moved through it as though through mist, half present, his thoughts still tied to the narrow boarding house and the woman clutching the torn photograph as if it were her last possession. He sat at his desk only long enough to light his pipe, his gaze fixed on the curling smoke. The official work waiting in folders before him seemed distant, irrelevant, as though belonging to another world. He knew the photograph, the whispered word twice, the unseen man who entered late and left before morning. Those were more pressing than any robbery or theft. He made a pretense of reading a file, but his mind wandered. The man's presence lingered in every detail. A jawline, a moustache blurred by a tear, footsteps at night, letters torn before being sent. The tenants had spoken of him reluctantly, never naming him, always as an absence or a shadow. It was as if he belonged to the building only in fragments, glimpsed in a passing moment, felt in the silence that followed. Maigret had encountered such figures before, men who inhabited the margins, half accepted, half denied, leaving traces not in evidence, but in the way others adjusted their lives around them. By midday he rose from his chair, his pipe empty, and left without a word. The air outside was cool, the drizzle returning, faint enough to wet his hat but not heavy enough to discourage him. He walked toward the Boulevard Saint-Martin at his usual pace, steady and deliberate, as if each step measured not distance but time itself. The concierge greeted him again with the same anxious expression. "She hasn't moved," he said, as though the woman's immobility were both a relief and a curse. But there was something new. "A letter came this morning. I placed it outside her door." She took it. I haven't seen her since. Maigret climbed the stairs slowly, the boards creaking beneath his weight. He paused outside her door. The room was quiet. He knocked once, lightly, then opened. She sat at the table as before, but the photograph was no longer in front of her. Instead, a letter lay open, its pages trembling slightly in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with something between fear and defiance. She looked at him only briefly before lowering her gaze again. Without asking permission, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He said nothing. He let the silence do the work. After a long moment, she whispered, "He wrote." Maigret lowered himself into the chair opposite her, his large hands resting on his knees. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a fact already known. He waited. She continued, barely audible. "He said he will come tonight." There was no need for her to say who. The shadow was taking form at last. Maigret studied her face. Beneath the weariness and fear there was expectation, a faint trembling of hope or dread. He could not tell which. She clutched the letter as if it bound her to life. He did not ask to see it. He knew she would not show him. Instead, he leaned back, pipe unlit, eyes steady on hers, and said only, "I'll be here." She shook her head weakly. He wouldn't come if he knew. Maigret allowed the words to hang between them. He did not argue. He knew she was right. But he also knew that waiting was his strongest ally. He could be present without being seen, silent in the shadows, as patient as the city itself. That evening, Maigret returned. He did not enter her room. Instead, he stationed himself in the dim corridor near the landing, his coat pulled around him, pipe cold in his pocket. The boarding house grew quiet as night settled. Tenants closed their doors, footsteps faded, and the smell of cooking gave way to the stillness of damp wood and faded wallpaper. From below came the occasional creak of the concierge's chair, the faint cough of the seamstress. Hours passed. Maigret remained motionless, as if carved into the wall itself. His patience was inexhaustible, his presence a weight in the silence. Midnight approached. Then faintly, the sound of footsteps outside the house, not hurried, not cautious, merely assured, as if the man belonged here, as if he had always belonged. The door opened softly. A figure entered. Tall coat collar turned up, hat low against the drizzle. He did not pause to greet the concierge. He moved directly to the stairs. Maigret stepped back into the shadows, his body still, his breath shallow. The man climbed steadily, his shoes making the boards creak in a rhythm Maigret already knew from the tenants' accounts. On the second floor he paused only once to glance toward the landing, then continued to the woman's door. A soft knock. The door opened and he slipped inside. The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the faint murmur of voices within. Maigret remained where he was, waiting, his patience like stone. He did not strain to hear, though fragments reached him. A low male voice, the faint tremor of hers. Then, after a long pause, the sound of something being placed on the table. Paper, perhaps. A letter, another photograph. Time stretched. The building seemed to hold its breath. At last the door opened again. The man emerged, his face obscured by shadow, his coat buttoned tight. He moved quickly now, descending the stairs without hesitation. Maigret did not follow. He simply watched, his eyes heavy-lidded but alert, noting the gait, the tilt of the shoulders, the way the man lit a cigarette before stepping out into the street. When the silence returned, Maigret walked slowly to the woman's door. He knocked once more and entered. She was at the table, tears streaming down her face, the letter crumpled in her hands. The photograph lay before her again, but this time it was whole. She had pieced it together with tape, the jagged lines still visible, but the faces reunited, however clumsily. Her body shook with quiet sobs, though her lips formed no words. Maigret stood over her, his shadow filling the room. He asked nothing. He knew the time for questions would come later. For now he observed the picture, the man's face restored, her own beside his, and another partly obscured, a child perhaps, or another woman, he could not yet tell. The second tearing, the second leaving. The photograph was beginning to explain itself. When he left her room, dawn was only hours away. The street outside was slick with rain, the lamps casting blurred halos on the pavement. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the smoke warming his chest. He did not yet know the man's name, but he had seen him. That was enough. He knew now that the truth would not stay hidden long. The city stirred faintly as he walked back toward the river, the night behind him, the case still in front of him, as patient and inevitable as the rain. Maigret rose earlier than usual, though he had slept little. The image of the man descending the stairs still occupied his thoughts, along with the trembling of the woman as she pieced together the torn photograph. He had seen enough to know the shadow was no longer intangible. The man existed, flesh and blood, with a gait, a height, the tilt of his shoulders, the way he struck a match carelessly before stepping into the rain. Maigret's gift was never to seize at once, but to let such impressions settle within him until they became undeniable. At breakfast, Madame Maigret placed eggs before him with her quiet efficiency. She said nothing of the lines around his eyes, though she must have noticed them. Instead, she remarked on the market stall near the corner where the vendor had begun selling spring onions, weeks too early for the season. He listened, nodding, grateful for the ordinary rhythm of her words. They anchored him, reminded him that life carried on even when mysteries refused sleep. Before leaving, she touched his arm lightly, a gesture that said more than questions would have. He arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres with the city still damp from the night's rain. Colleagues nodded, some curious, others indifferent as he passed through. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the murmur of conversations about robberies, frauds, missing persons. Yet to Maigret it all felt distant, noise around a signal he alone could hear. He sat briefly at his desk, lit his pipe and stared at the curling smoke until he felt the pattern of the night settle into him. Then he rose again, pulling his coat close, and returned to the Boulevard Saint-Martin. The concierge greeted him with a look that was half relief, half fear. "Did you see him?" he whispered, as if the house itself might overhear. "Yes," Maigret replied simply, and the man seemed startled as if he had expected denial. "You won't tell the others?" The concierge asked, his voice trembling. Maigret shook his head and climbed the stairs. The woman's door was closed. He did not enter, not yet. Instead, he lingered in the corridor, then moved deliberately toward the other tenants. His presence alone was often enough to loosen tongues. He began with the clerk, whose spectacles slipped again as he opened the door. "You've seen him," Maigret said, without preamble. The clerk flinched, his hands twisting. "Once or twice. Late at night. Always with his collar high, his hat low. I didn't look closely, but you heard him." The clerk nodded, swallowing hard. Heavy steps, he smoked. The smell lingered. Maigret watched him a moment longer, then left without further words. He crossed the hall to the seamstress. She admitted him reluctantly, her machine still clattering faintly as though it could drown out the conversation. "He comes, doesn't he?" Maigret asked, his tone mild, almost weary. Her hands paused on the cloth. She nodded once, curtly. "What does she call him?" The seamstress looked startled, then shook her head. "She never calls him anything, not even when she speaks of him to herself. Only silence. That told Maigret more than a name might have." He thanked her, left her to her work, and ascended to the old couple on the top floor. They greeted him with politeness but unease. "You've seen him," Maigret said. The old man nodded, his eyes narrowing with memory. "Once at the door." A sharp face, tired eyes. "He looked like a man carrying too much," the old woman added. "She loved him. Or still does. But he doesn't stay. He comes, then goes." Always leaving her smaller than before, Maigret remained silent, absorbing the words. He thanked them, and descended slowly, pausing at the woman's door. This time he knocked, waited, then entered. Waited, then entered. She sat at the table again, the photograph before her. It had been mended crudely with tape, the seams visible, but the faces aligned once more. Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was no immediate lowering of her gaze. She looked at him steadily, though her hands trembled faintly. "He came," she said simply. "I saw," Maigret replied. She hesitated, then asked, "You won't arrest him?" "Not yet," Maigret said. He sat opposite her, his pipe unlit, his large frame filling the chair. He waited. Her lips parted, but the words faltered. She looked at the photograph, at the man's face restored beside hers, and something like a sob escaped her. "He left me once," she whispered. "Then he came back. I thought it meant something. But he left again. And last night—" Her voice broke. She pressed her hands against her face. Maigret did not move. He let her cry quietly, the sound absorbed by the small room, by the faded wallpaper and the damp silence. When she grew still again, he asked softly, "What is his name?" She did not answer. Instead, she pushed the photograph toward him. Her fingers brushed the image of the man almost tenderly. Then she withdrew, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes lowered once more. Maigret studied the photograph. The man's features were clearer now. The strong jaw, the moustache, the faint shadow of tiredness beneath the eyes. A face that might have belonged to anyone in Paris, yet not quite ordinary. He folded the image carefully, placed it back on the table, and rose. That night, Maigret returned again to the corridor. He waited as he had before, his body still in the shadows, his breath steady. Midnight passed. The house was silent except for the creak of settling wood, but no footsteps came. The man did not return. It was not disappointment Maigret felt, but confirmation. Such men rarely came 2 nights in a row. They moved like ghosts, touching lives briefly, then vanishing, leaving silence heavier than their presence. Still, he remained until dawn's first light touched the narrow windows. Then he left, his coat damp with the night's chill, his pipe clenched between his teeth. The next day he began to make quiet inquiries. Not official, not yet. He asked a clerk at the post office if he recalled letters, a tobacconist near the boulevard, if a man with a mustache had bought cigarettes there late at night. Small questions scattered, each met with shrugs or faint recollections, but slowly a picture began to form. A man who worked irregular hours. A man known to linger near the boulevard, sometimes in cafes, always alone. A man not quite settled anywhere. By evening, Maigret returned once more to the boarding house. The woman was in her room, her eyes red from tears, the photograph now hidden from sight. She looked at him as though expecting judgment, but he gave none. He asked nothing. He only sat for a while, his presence filling the space until she grew calm again. When he left, the concierge stopped him at the door. "Who is he?" the man asked, his voice thin. Maigret paused, his broad frame casting a shadow across the narrow hall. "Someone who cannot stay," he said quietly. Then he stepped out into the rain, the city alive around him, its secrets pressing in from all sides. He did not yet have the man's name, but he felt it close, hovering on the edge of revelation. And he knew that patience, as always, would bring it forth. The following day, Paris seemed to stir under a sky the color of pewter, the damp air carrying the smell of coal smoke and wet stone. Maigret sat in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, his broad shoulders bent slightly, his pipe clamped between his teeth, though it had long gone cold. Papers lay scattered across the desk, but he barely glanced at them. His thoughts remained on the man he had seen in the shadows of the boarding house, the heavy steps on the stairs, the tilt of the hat brim that had concealed most of his face. The woman's silence had begun to fracture, but only in fragments, enough to suggest love betrayed, abandonment repeated, yet still no name. Names mattered little at first, Maigret knew. What mattered was the weight of the human ties, the invisible threads that bound people until they could not bear the strain. He rose finally, stretching his heavy frame, and left the office. The drizzle had returned, settling in a fine mist against his coat, and he welcomed it. Rain sharpened the city for him, made its corners more intimate, its secrets closer to the surface. He walked toward the boulevard without hurry, his gait steady, his eyes seeming to take in little yet missing nothing. The concierge greeted him with his usual nervousness, his hands twitching at his sides. "He hasn't come back," he whispered, as if the walls themselves might betray him. "She stays inside, always inside. I think she waits still." Maigret only nodded, then moved past him toward the stairs. He did not go at once to her room. Instead, he paused at the landing, listening, sensing the house as if it breathed. Air coughed from one floor above, the faint hum of the seamstress's machine, the muted sound of a radio behind a closed door. Ordinary life pressed close against the silence of the woman's waiting. He knocked softly and entered. She was there as always, the photograph now tucked inside a drawer, as though she could not bear to see it yet could not bear to discard it either. Her eyes followed him as he took the chair opposite her, his pipe unlit, his presence filling the small room. "He left you once," Maigret said, his tone almost conversational. Then he returned. Then he left again. Her lips trembled, but no words came. She pressed her hands together tightly, her knuckles pale. "Do you know where he goes?" Maigret asked. She shook her head. Her gaze dropped to her lap. then lifted again, uncertain, as though she wanted to speak but could not. "Does he have another?" A pause, long enough for the faint sound of rain against the window to intrude. Then she whispered, "Yes." The word was so soft Maigret barely heard it, yet it filled the room. She closed her eyes, her body rigid, as though the admission itself had cost her strength. "Who?" Maigret asked gently. She shook her head once more, but this time the gesture carried despair, not denial. He watched her for a long moment, then rose without pressing further. He knew when silence was more fertile than questions. In the corridor, he encountered the seamstress, who glanced nervously toward the woman's door. "You wait too," she said quietly, almost accusingly. "You wait for him." Maigret met her eyes steadily. "And you have seen him?" Her shoulders stiffened, then sagged. "Once," she admitted, "not here. In a café near the Porte Saint-Denis." He was with someone. A younger woman, pretty. She laughed a lot. He looked tired, but he smiled when she spoke. The words carried weight. Maigret tucked them away, unspoken, letting them settle. He thanked her with a brief nod and descended the stairs, his thoughts circling. A younger woman, laughter, a smile given reluctantly but given all the same. The other half of the photograph, perhaps in life if not on paper. That evening, Maigret walked through the cafés near Porte Saint-Denis. He did not ask directly. He rarely did. He ordered a glass of beer, sat near the window and listened. Conversations drifted around him. Clerks speaking of wages, women discussing neighbors, men muttering about horses or politics. Slowly faces became familiar. After 2 evenings he saw him. The man sat at a corner table, his hat pushed back, his moustache catching the dim light. He looked older than Maigret had expected. The lines around his mouth deep, his shoulders slumped as though carrying a weight too heavy. Beside him sat a younger woman, her laughter light, her hand brushing his arm. He smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed no joy. Maigret watched without seeming to, his beer untouched before him. When the man rose to leave, Maigret noted the heaviness of his gait, the same as on the stairs of the boarding house. He followed him only part of the way, enough to see him turn down a narrow street, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. Then he let him go. Patience, always patience. The next morning, Maigret returned to the boarding house. The woman's door was closed. When he entered, she sat in the same place. Her eyes hollow, the photograph returned to the table once more. He said nothing at first, only filled the silence with his presence. At last, he remarked, "I saw him." Her head jerked up, her eyes wide with something between fear and hope. "Where?" she whispered. "With someone else," Maigret answered. She closed her eyes and a shudder passed through her body. Her hands reached for the photograph, clutching it as though it might anchor her. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks, but she did not sob. "He left me twice," she said, her voice breaking. "Once for himself, and once for her." Maigret leaned back, his eyes heavy-lidded, his pipe unlit. He had no need to press further. The truth was beginning to surface, not through evidence, but through the slow collapse of her silence. The story was there, waiting to be told in full. He rose, leaving her with the photograph. On the stairs, the concierge waited, his eyes wide, his voice trembling. "It's not safe," he said. "Something will happen. I feel it." Maigret did not answer. He stepped into the rain once more, his coat collar high, his pipe finally lit. The city moved around him, indifferent, but he felt the story tightening, the threads pulling closer together. The man had a name, though unspoken. The woman had confessed, though in fragments. The shadow was almost fully formed, and Maigret, patient as always, knew it would not be long before the truth revealed itself, quietly, inevitably. As rain dripping from a roof until the weight grew too heavy to hold, the drizzle clung to Paris like a second skin, fine enough to seem invisible, until one felt the weight of dampness pressing into the shoulders of a coat. Maigret walked without hurry through the narrow streets that curved toward the boulevard, his pipe gripped between his teeth, though he had not yet struck a match. His thoughts circled around the man he had seen at the café, the younger woman's laughter like a note out of place in the heavy silence of the boarding house. It was not the laughter itself that troubled him, but the faint smile the man had given in response, a smile that seemed forced yet still, undeniably, a response. It revealed something the torn photograph had only suggested, that the woman upstairs in her small room was no longer the only thread tying him to life. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret made only a brief appearance. He nodded at colleagues who attempted to hand him papers, his broad figure moving through the corridors like a ship cutting through mist. A file lay unopened on his desk, the name of a robbery scrawled across the cover. He ignored it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, lit his pipe at last, and let the smoke curl slowly upward as though to carry his thoughts. He knew the man would return, not because of loyalty, but because men like that never severed ties completely. They drifted between women, between homes, between promises, always leaving fragments of themselves behind. What concerned Maigret was not the inevitability of his return, but the weight it would carry when he came again. That evening, Maigret returned to the boarding house. The concierge met him with nervous eyes, his hands wringing together. "She asked if you would come," he whispered, as though even speaking it aloud might disturb the fragile balance of the house. "She waits." On the second floor, the woman's door was closed. He knocked softly, then entered without waiting. She was at the table as before, the photograph spread before her, the tape lines still visible. Her eyes lifted to him, hollow yet steady. He saw at once she had not slept. The air of the room was heavy, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her despair. He sat across from her, filling the chair, his pipe unlit. After a long silence, he said simply, "He will come back." Her lips parted, a faint tremor passing through her. She nodded once, though the gesture carried no hope, only dread. She whispered, "He always does." Maigret watched her quietly, his large hands folded together. He asked nothing further, letting the silence stretch until it filled the room, pressing against her like a tide. At last she lowered her gaze and murmured, "He does not love me anymore." The words hung in the air, fragile, as though they might collapse under their own weight. Maigret did not contradict her. He knew the truth was not in declarations, but in the way her hands clutched the photograph, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of waiting. He left her then, without another word, and took his position once more in the dim corridor. Hours passed. The house grew quiet. Doors closed, lights dimmed, until only the sound of dripping rain and the occasional creak of wood filled the silence. Then at last, footsteps. The door below opened, closed softly. The same gait, heavy but unhurried, mounted the stairs. Maigret drew back into the shadows, his broad frame blending with the darkness. The man climbed steadily, his hat pulled low, his coat damp with rain. He paused briefly on the landing, as though sensing something, then moved toward her door. A knock, soft, familiar. The door opened and he entered. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by muffled voices. Maigret remained motionless, his patience inexhaustible. He caught fragments of their exchange, her voice trembling, his lower carrying impatience more than tenderness. At one point something struck the table, a fist perhaps, or an object thrown down in anger. Then silence again. When the door opened once more, the man stepped out, his face set in lines of weariness and irritation. He moved quickly, descending the stairs without looking back. Maigret let him pass, noting every detail, the scent of tobacco, the faint scuff of his shoes, the way his shoulders hunched as though bracing against a burden. He did not follow. He would have time enough later. When the house was quiet again, Maigret knocked softly and entered. She sat at the table, her face pale, her eyes wide with the residue of tears. The photograph lay torn again, the tape lines ripped through, the pieces scattered across the table like a body broken apart. Her hands trembled as she clutched one fragment, her own face intact yet severed from the others. "He left me again," she whispered. Maigret lowered himself into the chair opposite her. He said nothing. He simply filled the silence until she began to speak, her words halting, broken. "He promised once. Long ago, then he left. Years later he returned, and I thought it meant something. But it was only to take more from me." Her voice faltered. She pressed the fragment of the photograph against her chest, as though it could still give warmth. "He has another," Maigret said quietly. Her eyes closed, and her face twisted in pain. She nodded once. "You know her." She nodded again, more faintly. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Maigret studied her, the trembling of her hands, the hollow of her cheeks, the despair that clung to her like the dampness of the air. He knew she was near the edge, not of violence perhaps, but of collapse. The truth was pressing against her, and soon it would break free. He rose then slowly and placed his hat back on his head. He said only, I'll return tomorrow." She looked at him with something like pleading in her eyes, but no words came. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the street slick and shining under the lamps. Maigret lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward into the night. He walked without hurry toward the river, his thoughts circling not on the man but on the woman, her silence fraying, her strength ebbing. He knew the collapse would come soon, and with it the truth she could no longer contain. He reached the Quai des Orfèvres near dawn, the city stirring awake. He did not enter. Instead, he stood by the river, the water dark and swollen, the smoke from his pipe drifting into the damp air. He thought of the photograph, torn once, torn again, pieced together and broken apart. A life reduced to fragments, each tear deeper than the last. He knew now that the man was not the center of the story. The woman was, and it was through her that the hidden truth would finally reveal itself. The morning began with a pale light, filtering weakly through the clouds, the kind of hesitant brightness that never quite managed to lift the dampness from the streets. Maigret left his apartment after a quiet breakfast with Madame Maigret, who had said little beyond a remark about the weather being stubborn this year. He carried her words with him as he walked toward the river, pipe in his mouth, coat collar high. His thoughts remained with the woman in the boarding house, her despair thickening like the air before a storm. She had admitted too much now for the silence to hold. He felt the collapse drawing near, as inevitable as rain. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he gave a nod to colleagues but did not stop. Files could wait. This could not. He struck a match for his pipe as he stepped into the drizzle again, the smoke curling upward into the mist. He made his way back to the Boulevard Saint-Martin, his pace steady, as though time itself bent around his patience. The concierge greeted him with anxious eyes, his voice hushed. "She has not eaten. She has not spoken. She sits only with the photograph. I fear she will lose herself." Maigret climbed the stairs without answering. The woman was at the table as before, but the fragments of the photograph were spread differently, no longer pieced together but scattered, as if she had abandoned even the effort of repair. Her eyes lifted to him, hollow yet burning with something desperate. He sat opposite her, his presence filling the small room. "He will not stay," Maigret said quietly, almost kindly. "He cannot." She gave a strangled laugh, brittle, empty of humor. "He never stays." She pressed a fragment of the photograph between her fingers until it bent. "He left me for her, and when he came back I thought it meant I mattered still. But it meant nothing. He wanted only to see if he could, Her words poured out in a rush, her voice shaking, her hands trembling. She stopped suddenly, staring at him with eyes wide and frightened, as though she had betrayed too much. But Maigret did not press. He leaned back, pipe between his teeth, silent, steady. The silence drew more from her than questions would. She whispered, "I waited for him, years. I built my life around a shadow. And when he came again, I gave him everything I had left." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Maigret let her cry. He watched the fragments of the photograph glint faintly in the dim light, jagged edges like pieces of glass. He understood then what she could not yet say. The photograph had been torn twice because the leaving had been worse the second time. The wound reopened where it had never healed. When her sobs quieted, he asked softly, "Who is she?" Her hands dropped to the table, her eyes red. "A girl," she whispered. "Younger. She works in a shop near Port Saint-Denis. She does not know what she has taken. She only laughs, and he cannot resist her laughter." The words hung in the room like smoke. Maigret absorbed them without change of expression. He rose finally, heavy and deliberate, and placed his hat on his head. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will come again." She looked at him, lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Outside, the drizzle thickened, turning the pavement slick. Maigret walked slowly toward the river, his pipe glowing faintly in the gloom. He thought of the younger woman's laughter, of the older woman's despair, of the man caught between them not by malice but by weakness. Such stories were never about villains, only about people unable to resist their own frailties. That evening Maigret returned once more to the cafes near Port Saint-Denis. He saw the man again with the younger woman beside him, her laughter bright, his smile faint but present. He watched them without moving, his glass of beer untouched. When they left, he followed briefly, enough to note the direction, the shop where she worked, the street where he vanished into the night. Then he let them go. The next morning he went back to the boarding house. The woman was waiting. She looked at him with eyes that no longer held fear but resignation. "I know," she said simply, as if he had told her everything without words. "She knows nothing of me. She never will." Her voice trembled, but she did not cry. Instead, she gathered the fragments of the photograph and pushed them across the table toward him, her hands shaking. "Take it. I cannot keep tearing it apart." Maigret placed the pieces carefully in his coat pocket. He stood, pipe heavy in his hand, and looked at her for a long moment. He saw then not guilt, but the exhaustion of someone who had carried too much for too long. He nodded once, then left her in the silence she had chosen. In the corridor, the concierge whispered, "Will you stop him?" Maigret paused on the landing, his shadow filling the narrow space. "No," he said slowly. "He will stop himself. They always do." He descended the stairs and stepped out into the rain. The city seemed to exhale around him, its streets glistening, its air heavy with coal smoke and damp stone. He walked toward the river, his pipe lit, the smoke mingling with the mist. He knew the collapse was coming, not in violence but in truth, and when it came it would not be with shouting, but with the quiet weight of a secret finally spoken aloud. The river was swollen with the previous night's rain, the surface dark and restless, carrying debris from upstream. Maigret stood for a long while on the embankment before turning away, his collar raised, his pipe sending up slow curls of smoke. The fragments of the photograph pressed against the inside of his coat pocket, sharp edges reminding him with each step of the story that still waited to be told. He knew the woman could not hold the silence much longer. Secrets became heavier the longer they were carried, and she had carried hers until her body trembled beneath the weight. When he arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres, his colleagues greeted him with routine nods. Files lay on his desk, some marked urgent, but he pushed them aside with the patience of a man who understood urgency differently from others. To him, urgency was not the speed of papers shuffled, but the trembling of hands around a photograph, the fracture in a voice whispering of betrayal. He filled his pipe again, stared at the curling smoke until it blurred his vision, then rose. Without a word he left the building and returned to the Boulevard Saint-Martin. The concierge was waiting, as always, in the dim hallway. His face was pale, his hands restless. "She is worse," he whispered, his voice fearful. "She hardly moves. She hardly breathes." Maigret climbed the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. At her door he paused, then pushed it open. The woman was seated at the table, but she was not looking at the torn photograph. Her gaze was fixed on nothing, her body rigid, her hands pressed flat against the wood as though anchoring herself. The room was heavy with silence. He sat across from her, his presence filling the space. For a long time he said nothing. He let the quiet surround them until it became unbearable. Then gently he said, "You can tell me." Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her eyes flicked toward the drawer where the photograph had once been kept, then back to him. Tears welled in her eyes, spilled slowly down her cheeks. She whispered, "He left me twice." But not only for her. Maigret leaned slightly forward, pipe in hand, his eyes steady. "Go on," he said quietly. Her hands trembled. "The first time, years ago, it was for another woman. She was older than me, not younger. He promised he would return, but he did not. I waited. I built my life around waiting. Then one day he came again. I thought it was forgiveness. I thought it was love renewed." She stopped, swallowing hard. Her fingers clawed at the table, as though pulling words from it. "But he had another life, a child. He showed me once in a photograph. He tore it when I begged him not to go to them. He tore it in anger." That was the first tear. Maigret's eyes dropped briefly to the fragments he carried in his pocket. The edges, the jagged lines, they had not been only hers. The second tear, she whispered, was mine. When he left again. When I knew the child was more to him than I ever could be. Her voice cracked. She pressed her hands to her face, sobs shaking her thin frame. Maigret remained still, his broad presence steady, absorbing her grief without interruption. He saw it now. The photograph had not been only of lovers, but of a family. She had been part of it once, or believed she was, until the truth split it apart. The man had left her not merely for another woman, but for the bond of blood. When her sobs quieted, she looked at him with hollow eyes. "What is left of me now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Maigret did not answer. He reached into his coat, withdrew the fragments and placed them carefully on the table before her. The torn faces, the jagged seams lay between them like the body of the story itself. She touched the pieces with trembling fingers, tracing the lines. Her voice came again, low, resigned. "You see now why I could not tell. There was no crime, not in the way you look for, only the cruelty of being left behind." Maigret leaned back, pipe heavy in his hand. He said nothing. The truth did not always bring justice or resolution. Sometimes it brought only the quiet collapse of a soul. Yet this was his work, as much as any arrest or conviction, to witness, to understand, to let the hidden lives of ordinary people reveal themselves. He stayed with her until her breathing steadied, until the fragments of the photograph lay once more arranged on the table, imperfectly pieced together. Then he rose, placed his hat on his head and stepped into the corridor. The concierge was waiting, his face tense with curiosity. Maigret shook his head. "There is nothing for you to know," he said quietly, and descended the stairs. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. The lamps along the boulevard glowed faintly in the dim light. Maigret walked slowly toward the river, his pipe lit, the smoke curling upward into the damp evening. He thought of the woman, her silence broken, her secret laid bare. He thought of the man, weak rather than wicked, torn between women, between promises, between lives. He thought of the child, unseen but central, the true pivot of the story. At a cafe near the quay he stopped, ordered a glass of beer and sat near the window. He watched the passers-by, clerks and shopgirls, couples and children, each carrying unseen burdens, each with their own quiet tragedies. He drank slowly, savoring the bitter taste. It was not triumph he felt, nor satisfaction. Only a deep weariness, the kind that came from understanding too much of human frailty. He knew he would carry the image of the torn photograph with him, long after the case itself faded. When at last he rose to leave, he walked toward home, where Madame Maigret would be waiting with supper, with her quiet, steady presence that never demanded explanations. He would sit with her, eat, perhaps speak of the weather, perhaps not. And the city would carry on indifferent, its streets wet with rain, its secrets hidden in boarding houses and cafes, in letters torn and photographs broken. For Maigret, that was enough. The final days of the case unfolded, not with revelations shouted in courtrooms or arrests made under bright lights, but in silence, as though the city itself wished to bury the story under its endless rhythm of rain and footsteps. Maigret returned once more to the boarding house, though by then he knew there was nothing left to discover. The concierge received him with his habitual nervousness, but there was relief in his eyes too, as if a storm had passed without breaking the windows. On the second floor the woman sat in her room, the fragments of the photograph now gathered into an envelope that lay unopened on the table. Her face had changed, not softened but stilled, like a wound that had ceased to bleed. When Maigret entered, she looked at him without fear, without defiance. Only the resignation of someone who had accepted her place in a story, written long before she could alter its course. He sat opposite her, his large hands folded on his knees, his pipe unlit. Neither spoke for a long while. At last she said, "I told you everything." "There is nothing more," he nodded. "I know." Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the drizzle traced faint lines against the glass. "He will not return," she said, her voice flat. "Not here. He belongs elsewhere now." Maigret rose slowly, his heavy frame filling the small room. He looked once at the envelope, then at her and gave a small nod. She would live on quietly in her narrow room, her life reduced to silence and memories. It was not a crime that bound her, but the deeper cruelty of being forgotten. Downstairs, the concierge asked in a low voice, "Will she be all right?" Maigret paused on the threshold. "She will endure," he said simply. "People do." He stepped out into the street, the air cool, the rain softened into mist. He lit his pipe at last, drawing deeply, letting the smoke steady him. He walked slowly along the boulevard, the lamps casting halos on the wet pavement, the city breathing around him in its endless, indifferent rhythm. At a small cafe, he stopped for a glass of beer. He sat near the window, watching clerks hurry home, women clutching parcels, children splashing in puddles. Ordinary lives, each carrying its own quiet burdens, invisible to passers-by. He thought of the man, weak rather than cruel, incapable of choosing, drifting from one woman to another until the ties frayed and snapped. He thought of the younger woman whose laughter had captured him, not knowing the cost. And he thought of the woman in the boarding house, who had carried her love like an illness, torn between hope and despair until the truth had broken her silence. The photograph had been torn twice, but even pieced together, it revealed not harmony but fracture. The image itself was no longer important. What mattered was what it had held, the memory of belonging, the illusion of permanence. And when those were gone, nothing remained but paper and silence. Maigret drained his glass, rose, and stepped once more into the damp air. The Seine glistened dark under the lamps, carrying the city's secrets away as it always did. He walked toward home, where Madame Maigret would be waiting with quiet talk of the market, of neighbors, of small things that anchored life. He would say little, but his silence would carry no weight, only the comfort of having been understood. Behind him, the city went on, boarding houses and cafes, letters written and torn, photographs hidden in drawers. He had seen enough to know that most tragedies were like this one, not crimes that demanded justice, but wounds that never healed, carried quietly by ordinary people. And as the rain fell softly on the stones of Paris, Maigret walked steadily, his pipe glowing in the dark, weary but calm. A man who had once again borne witness to the frailty of human hearts, frailty of human